DSLRs have been around for a very long time, and if you're a photographer like me, you've used one growing up and you've loved them just as much as I have. They're a great camera system overall, and they produce great images and just perform on a very high level. And with the advent of mirrorless cameras recently, we've seen a lot of changes taking place in the camera economy where people are switching from DSLR to mirrorless. So the question really remains, are DSLRs actually dying, or will they continue to live on for decades upon decades? That's the question I'll be answering in this video, and it might not be as simple as you think. What's up guys, it's Project Photography back in the video, and today so if you love DSLRs like me, seeing all these mirrorless cameras come out is a little bit daunting because we don't want our DSLR support to go away, and we love them just as much as our mirrorless cameras. But it's really hard to ignore the trend of mirrorless cameras becoming the future of the camera world. So there's two aspects that I really want to look at when asking the question, are DSLRs actually dying out? The first aspect of this question is the merit of DSLRs relative to mirrorless. We're going to talk about how the transition was from film to DSLRs and try to compare that to how the transition for DSLRs and mirrorless is going to be. The other aspect that we really want to talk about is how we have to look at the economy of cameras. These two aspects, which is the merit of DSLRs and the performance obviously, as well as the economy of the camera kind of world, how that's going to play into the effects of DSLRs actually dying. And we really need to understand these two core aspects of this entire situation, really grasp and understand how the DSLRs are going to trend and how they'll end up going extinct or not going extinct and so on. So let's dive right into the first main aspect of this video, where I talk about the merits of DSLRs relative to mirrorless. So to kind of talk about and compare how the DSLR to mirrorless transition is going to happen, we really need to think about the film to DSLR transition. Now, when film was coming into, going out of film and coming to the age of DSLRs, switching to DSLRs in the long term was an absolute no-brainer. You did not think about it, that's just something you did. Because first of all, image quality on DSLRs was much better than film. You can see the photos right after they're taken, so you can shoot upon shoot upon shoot and just have a bunch of photos without actually having to go get them developed. It was faster to get the photos, transfer on a computer, and so on. We got a faster frames per second shooting, and shooting things like sports was much more manageable because with a roll of film you had, I think 36 was the max, whereas with an SD card or whatever digital card you have, you can pretty much shoot unlimited, and you don't have to really worry about how much space you have. So you can shoot pretty much an unlimited amount of photos. Overall, superior technology when moving from film to DSLRs. And it was very, very apparent that DSLRs were going to be outpacing film in the near future. There's just no brainer. Then making that switch was just something you had to do. But when it comes to the transition from film to DSLRs relative to DSLRs to mirrorless, there are a few key points that really stand out to me, and how that transition from DSLRs to mirrorless is not going to be nearly as obvious. First of all, when we're comparing mirrorless to DSLRs, both pretty much have the same image quality. You can stick a sensor for a mirrorless camera inside of a DSLR and vice versa. We still have great cameras like the Nikon D850 that's going to have image quality that is going to be great for years upon years upon years. DSLRs still have incredible autofocusing systems. I think we forget how good they are. If you look at the D5 system, the D4 system even, they all perform at extremely high levels. So good to the point where you can literally use them for years upon years upon years and not feel like you have a slowed down autofocusing system. And that point right there, I think, is the most important aspect to talk about when it comes to comparing mirrorless and DSLRs, because DSLRs, yes, of course, don't have things like eye autofocus. They don't have insanely good subject tracking like mirrorless cameras, but when it comes to dynamic area AF, group AF, all these other things, even tracking for DSLRs are still very, very good. We really forget how good they are because we're talking about mirrorless autofocus so much. And with that being said, they both shoot at similar speeds. Of course, I know mirrorless can shoot up to 30 frames per second, but in reality, that's not absolutely necessary for shooting great action shots. I mean, you can get away with shooting with 10 frames per second for sure. Like, I've used DSLRs in the past and I didn't feel like I needed 30 frames per second. That's more like a want. So when you're comparing those, I mean, mirrorless does have an obvious advantage, but when we're talking about actual performance, it's not going to make a massive difference. But of course, mirrorless does have some key advantages over DSLRs. The main one is that you can see exposure through the EVF. They tend to have better video specs than DSLRs. They're much more lighter weight. They have bigger mounts, like the Nikon Z mount is massive. Canon EOS R mount, also massive. The technology like IAF is definitely a selling point for these things. I mean, once you use IAF, it's very hard to go back to something like a DSLR. But that doesn't mean you still can't take the great images that you normally would with a DSLR. Even when comparing the merits of mirrorless versus DSLRs, one key question when talking about performance is, can you do what you can with a mirrorless with a DSLR? And 99% of the time, it's an outstanding yes. With mirrorless, it's gonna be easier for sure, but that doesn't mean you can't get the same shot with the DSLR. And that just wasn't the case when comparing film with DSLRs. Film just could not perform at the same level as DSLRs, and that's just facts. I mean, first of all, being able to shoot unlimited amount of photos versus film, you only get 36 per roll. And there's just a whole bunch of other slew of advantages that DSLRs had. So with that being said, DSLRs can still do what mirrorless cameras can without a degradation in image quality or performance at all. Mirrorless cameras are just much more convenient. That's how it is. And pretty much whatever a mirrorless camera can shoot, a DSLR can shoot as well. That's just not the case with film, and I kind of talked about that earlier. So when we're comparing merits of DSLRs versus mirrorless, I mean, it's so clear cut to think that, you know what, performance wise, they can both perform at very high levels. The camera in that situation is not going to hold you back, unlike how it was for film for DSLRs. I mean, just even think about timeless cameras like the Nikon D4, Nikon D850, Nikon D5, Nikon D500. They all perform at extremely high levels, and you can be sure that, when you're using this camera now versus years down the road, they're all going to perform really well, and you can be sure that, you're going to get the same performance as you did from day one. So now we talked about the merits of DSLRs versus mirrorless. It's obvious that, performance wise, they're both going to perform at a very high level, mainly because of the great image quality as well as the great autofocus performance that DSLRs still have. There's still something that I love about DSLRs. Their autofocus performance is just insane. So the second aspect that we must talk about when talking about are DSLRs going to be dying is the economy of cameras. And I think this is where a lot of people are starting to realize that DSLRs might be on the way out because of that discussion of the economics of the camera system as a whole and just how that dynamic is going to play out. A big part of this is definitely the hype around mirrorless cameras. Once I believe the Sony a7 III came into the play, a lot of people said, you know what? This is definitely the future. I can see myself picking up a mirrorless in the future because of the 2 card slots, because of the great autofocusing system, and just the convenience of mirrorless overall. I think the Sony a7 III was definitely a turning point when it comes to the demand for mirrorless cameras. And with that hype around that camera and hype around mirrorless cameras in general, we see these camera companies having to adjust, right? They're saying, okay, people want more mirrorless cameras. People are going to be expecting more mirrorless cameras. So it is our job to meet that demand and create cameras that people really want to enjoy and use. And as a company, it would be crazy to not see that level of hype, that level of trend of mirrorless cameras and not create something for that. So this consumer demand has led Canon and Nikon, mainly the 2 big dogs in the camera world, to jump in and fight for that mirrorless crown. And with this trend of DSLRs kind of plateauing right now, and they might start to go down in terms of consumer demand with mirrorless going up, it's hard pressed to say that, DSLRs are going to be still a thing of the future, right? Like if we see that over time, people are going to start phasing out their DSLRs for mirrorless stuff, I can't see camera companies, supporting DSLRs in the long run. And we're talking like maybe 7 to 10 years down the road. There's going to be a point where mirrorless cameras are going to have so much demand, so much people wanting them, where, it's hard to recommend going to a DSLR system. Just if I were to recommend someone again to a system, it would be really hard to recommend a DSLR just because of the offerings of mirrorless and what's out there. And a lot of it really has to go with consumer demand. And companies' goal is just to make profit and to follow consumer demand. So if they can do that, they're going to be following the trends of mirrorless, and it's pretty obvious where that trend is going. And like I said, if this trend continues, there's going to be a day where DSLRs are not being produced. And over time, that support for DSLRs is going to be cut down. We're going to see F-mount sort of fade away eventually. We're going to see the original Canon EF mount kind of fade away and all those sorts of things. And down the road, little DSLRs are going to be actually produced. So overall, that question I asked at the beginning, are DSLRs going to be dying or are they going to continue to live? It's definitely a twofold question, because of course the merits of DSLRs, they still perform at a, like I said, at a very high level. So if you really wanted to and you really love your DSLRs that much, you could literally buy the DSLRs you have right now and stick with them maybe 10 years down the road. I mean, it's really hard to say that, you know, they're not going to be performing at the same level, because they really are. But if you want to keep up with the camera trends and, you know, the hype of technology, the new things that come out with these different camera companies, switching to mirrorless is kind of something that you have to do, just because of what's happening with the technology and the consumer demand and how companies are going to be responding to that. So in a sense, no, DSLRs will never technically die out just because of their merits, just because how they are like created. You know, the performance is still going to be great. So if you wanted to use DSLRs, yes, you could. It's not like you could go out and use a film camera for professional events, for professional shoots, but you really could with DSLRs. I can definitely see that in the future. But in terms of support, in terms of how people are going to be viewing them, in terms of the consumer demand, over the long run, I mean, they are going to die out in terms of like creating new products and all that. But if you really love your DSLRs and you just want to use them for the rest of your photography career, you're more than welcome to do so, because they can perform at that high level. So they will continue to live in the die-hard consumer DSLR enthusiasts out there who really love to use it for professional work. It's not going to die out anytime soon, just because of what the grasp of DSLRs have on the market. Foundation is really solid. Pretty much every single professional, at least sports photographer I know, uses DSLRs. It's Nikon D5s, D6s, 1DX Mark IIs and 3s. So it's really hard to say that they're going to switch like that. But if you enjoy DSLRs, don't feel like you have to switch right away. Just understand where that trend is going and understand that, you know, if you want to jump on to that train of being first in line for technology and the mirrorless world and the camera world, where that's heading towards, making that switch to mirrorless is going to be, you know, something that you have to do. So let me know what you guys think about my take about this. Let me know down in the comment section down below what you think what is going to happen in the camera world when it comes to DSLRs. So let me know what you guys think. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.